The truck's engine hummed a low, tired note as it climbed the final bend towards Cedar Falls. Mason Reynolds gripped the steering wheel with calloused hands, veins raised like old road maps across his knuckles. His blue-gray eyes, the color of storm clouds over distant horizons, scanned the mountainside where late winter snow still clung to pine trees. 6 years in desert combat zones, followed by 4 years of construction work, had etched permanent lines around those eyes marks of a man who had seen too much and slept too little. Beside him, Scout sat upright, silver cream fur catching the fading afternoon light. The German shepherd's amber eyes tracked every movement outside swaying birch limbs, a hawk circling over the valley, a lone mail truck pulling away from a cluster of buildings ahead. Service in Afghanistan had shaped the dog's vigilance, carved alertness into every muscle. His ears swiveled at each new sound, his posture military straight, except for the slight lean toward his human companion. Mason's duffel bag in the back contained everything he owned now: 3 changes of clothes, a worn leather photo album, tools from his construction days, and $743 in his checking account. The divorce had taken most of his savings. The layoff had taken his income. The nightmares had taken his peace. The court had limited his time with Emma to supervise visits after his ex-wife Janet testified about his erratic behavior and instability. Just passing through, Mason whispered more to himself than to Scout. The dog's ear twitched in acknowledgement. Just a place to regroup. The letter that had brought him here lay folded in his jacket pocket, official letterhead from Harmon and Associates Attorneys at Law. The wording still puzzled him. In accordance with the last will and testament of Samuel Harper, you have been granted tenancy of Room 3 at Evergreen Lodge, Cedar Falls. All arrangements have been made. No explanation, no connection he could recall to anyone named Harper, just an address and a key. Cedar Falls emerged around the bend, a pocket of civilization nestled beneath towering mountains. The small town looked like something from a postcard, with its main street lined with wooden storefronts, lampposts wound with evergreen garlands, and smoke curling from stone chimneys. The frozen lake at the town's edge reflected the late afternoon sun, its surface a mirror of crystallized gold. Mason's truck rumbled past the Welcome to Cedar Falls sign with its population count of 287. A banner stretched across Main Street announced Annual Northern Bell Festival, 125 years of tradition. People moved with purpose along the sidewalks, carrying boxes of decorations and hanging paper lanterns between buildings. Not tourist locals preparing for something meaningful. Beyond the commercial district, Evergreen Lodge appeared like a sentinel on a gentle rise overlooking the lake. The 2-story log structure commanded attention, with its wide porches, heavy stone chimney, and warm light bleeding through windows like honey from a cracked jar. Snow dusted the roof, and the line of stacked wood along the side wall suggested someone who lived by discipline and foresight. Mason parked beside a cluster of cars with local plates. His boots worn brown leather, scuffed by service, and hard labor crunched in day-old snow as Scout leapt down beside him. The cold air bit instantly at his face, sharper than he'd expected, carrying the clean scent of pine and wood smoke. He tugged his burnt orange canvas coat tighter around his frame, the fabric rugged and patched at one shoulder where field thread had stood in for a tailor. The front door opened before he reached it. A small woman with silver hair pulled back into a neat low bun stood framed in the doorway. Her face, lined by decades of mountain winters, held the quiet strength of someone who had survived enough storms to find humor in drizzle. Her cardigan was moss green over a simple gray wool skirt, her shoes sensible and scuffed by real work, not fashion. Sharp, assessing hazel eyes took in Mason and Scout with a single sweeping glance. "You must be Reynolds," she said, her voice brisk but not unkind. "Figured you'd show up today. Weather reports said the pass would clear." Mason nodded, adjusting the duffel strap on his shoulder. "Yes, ma'am, Mason Reynolds." The woman's gaze shifted to Scout, noting the harness with the nameplate, the disciplined posture, the watchful eyes. "And your partner?" "Scout, best soldier I ever served with." Mason's hand automatically dropped to the dog's head, finding comfort in the warm fur. "Doesn't talk back." A hint of a smile touched the woman's lips. "That's more than I can say for most guests." She studied the scars visible beneath Scout's fur at the shoulder. "Looks like he's seen as much as you have." "More than most of us, ma'am," Mason replied softly. She stepped aside. "I'm Vivian Harper. This was my husband's place before it was mine. Samuel would have liked that you came with backup. She gestured toward the interior. Come in. Room three's been waiting. Inside, the lodge felt like stepping into warmth older than electricity. The entryway opened into a great room with log walls darkened by time and wood smoke. Hand-woven rugs covered sections of the wide plank flooring. A stone fireplace large enough to stand in dominated the far wall, flames crackling around logs thick as Mason's forearm. The scent of lemon oil and pine hung in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of baked goods coming from somewhere deeper in the building. A board of guest names hung behind a polished reception counter. Mason noted only 4 of the 12 room keys missing. Winter was clearly the quiet season here. Vivian moved behind the counter with the efficiency of someone who had performed the same routine for decades. She retrieved a brass key attached to a wooden tag carved with the number 3. Weekly rates are fair. I don't do trouble and I don't do late-night nonsense. Her tone suggested this wasn't negotiable. Breakfast from 6 to 9. Common areas close at 10. That dog of yours stays with you or on leash. Mason nodded. Yes, ma'am, we won't cause any problems. Vivian studied him, her gaze uncomfortably perceptive. Army? She asked, tone casual but eyes knowing. She had clearly known soldiers before. They carried silence a certain way. Yes, ma'am, combat engineer. 3 tours. She nodded once. Not pity, not admiration, recognition. And you brought your shadow. She gestured toward Scout. Pilot's part of the deal. Mason kept his tone light, though everyone who knew anything about service dogs understood they weren't pets. They were necessities. For you or for him, she asked. Mason hesitated. It was never a simple answer. For whoever needs him. Vivian's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Up those stairs, 3rd door on the right. Floorboards complain a bit, but they don't bite, usually. The stairs creaked under Mason's weight, each step voicing the age of the building. The upstairs hallway smelled of cedar and old books, brass wall sconces, casting pools of warm light every few feet. Room 3 stood at the middle of the hallway, its door the same weathered oak as the others. Mason turned the brass key in the lock. The door swung open to reveal a simple, comfortable space. A queen-size bed with a pine frame occupied the center, covered in a quilt patterned with geometric shapes in deep blues and forest greens. A small writing desk stood beneath a window overlooking the mountains. A chest of drawers and an armchair completed the furnishings. Nothing fancy, nothing frivolous, just honest craftsmanship and clean simplicity. He placed his duffel quietly on the floor beside the bed. Scout circled the room's perimeter, once sniffing at the baseboards and under the furniture before sitting near the corner, establishing a position with good sight lines to both the door and window. Mason exhaled. The quiet pressed in, not heavy but unfamiliar. Peace could feel like danger to a man who had learned to survive tension. Outside, the last light painted the mountains in purple and gold. Glass panes rattled softly as wind brushed the eaves. Mason sat on the edge of the bed, removing a folded piece of paper from his pocket. The letter that had brought him here. His eyes traced the words again, searching for meaning. Samuel Harper, a man he'd never met, leaving him a room in a lodge he'd never visited in a town he'd never heard of until 2 weeks ago. That was when Scout stood. No gradual rise, just a sudden alert posture, ears cutting through stillness. He moved to a section of floor near the far wall and placed one paw down, slow, careful, his body-stilled nose lowering close to the boards. Then he let out 3 short contained barks, not loud but precise, each one sharp like a coded signal. Mason lifted a brow. What is it, buddy mice? Scout's ears twitched, tail stiff but low. Mason knelt, pressing fingers to the wood where Scout stood. Nothing felt off. No wobble, no hollow shift. Maybe the dog sensed a draft or settling timber, but Scout continued staring at the patch of floor with the silent conviction of someone who heard a language others missed. A knock sounded from the hallway, followed by a small voice. Hello, new person. Mason opened the door to find a girl of about 9 standing there, dark hair in 2 braids, wearing jeans with embroidered flowers along the hem and a purple sweater a size too big. Her eyes widened at the sight of Scout. Is that a police dog? Her voice held no fear, only fascination. Military, his name's Scout. The girl's face lit with recognition. Like in the army? My Uncle Ricky was in the army. He has pictures with dogs like that in the desert. Mason nodded, finding himself oddly disarmed by her enthusiasm. That's right. Scout served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Now he's retired like me. I'm Lisa. My mom makes all the bread and pastries here. She pointed downward, presumably toward the kitchen. She said to tell the new guest, dinner's at 6 if you want some. Her attention returned to Scout. Can I pet him? Mason glanced at Scout, who remained focused on the floor patch. Maybe tomorrow. He's working right now. Lisa followed Scout's gaze to the floor. Her expression changed childish excitement, giving way to something older, more knowing. Oh, he hears it too. Mason's pulse quickened slightly. Here's what? The house talking. She said it matter-of-factly, as though stating the sky was blue. My grandpa said old houses remember things. Before Mason could respond, a woman's voice called from the stairwell. Lisa, I told you not to bother the guests. Lisa gave an exaggerated sigh. Coming, Mom. She took a step back, then whispered, The man in the mountain comes through the floor sometimes. That's what my dreams say. Then she darted away, feet pattering down the hallway. Mason closed the door, turning back to Scout, who hadn't moved. The man in the mountain, huh? He tried to keep his tone light, but something about the girl's words raised the hair on the back of his neck. Scout finally looked up at him, amber eyes serious, before returning his attention to the floor. Mason knelt again, examining the boards more carefully. They were wide planks of old-growth vining, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. This section looked no different from the others, yet Scout remained convinced. Mason pressed his palm flat against the wood. That's when he felt it, the faintest vibration, like the ghost of a heartbeat beneath the floorboard. Then a soft tap, so subtle he might have imagined it. Scout's ears shot forward. Mason whispered, Yeah, I hear it too, buddy. The sound never repeated. Silence rushed back, thick as the snow outside. Mason rose slowly, a familiar tension creeping into his shoulders. Engineers noticed patterns others missed. Soldiers trusted anomalies. Something wasn't right about this room, this lodge, or the reason he'd been summoned here. The dinner bell rang from downstairs, a clear, bright note that seemed to vibrate in the old timbers of the lodge. Mason hesitated, glancing again at Scout, who had finally relaxed his posture. Whatever had caught the dog's attention had gone quiet, at least for now. Let's go eat, then figure out what we've gotten ourselves into. The dining room occupied the east wing of the lodge's first floor. A long harvest table of polished oak dominated the space, surrounded by mismatched chairs that somehow coordinated in their very lack of uniformity. Oil lamps supplemented the overhead lighting, casting a golden glow that softened the faces of the guests seated around the table. Vivian stood at the head, ladling stew into ceramic bowls. Help yourself to a seat, Mr. Reynolds. We're casual here. She nodded toward Scout. There's a place for him by the fire if he'd rather not be underfoot. As if understanding, Scout padded toward the stone hearth, where a braided rug offered comfortable space away from the table, but with clear sight lines to Mason. He settled there, paws tucked with military neatness, eyes alert but relaxed. Mason took an empty chair next to an elderly man with weathered hands and suspenders over a flannel shirt. Across from him sat a middle-aged couple in matching sweaters who smiled politely but returned to their whispered conversation. At the far end, a young woman with a laptop closed it as he sat, offering a tired nod before focusing on her soup. Vivian placed a steaming bowl in front of Mason. The rich aroma of venison and root vegetables rose with the steam. Garden vegetables and local game, she explained. Nothing fancy, but it'll stick to your ribs. Mason nodded his thanks, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd eaten a home-cooked meal. The stew was hearty and perfectly seasoned, the meat tender, the broth rich with herbs he couldn't name. He ate slowly, savoring each spoonful while listening to the quiet conversations around him. The elderly man beside him spoke without looking up from his bowl. Walter Thompson. Been doing carpentry in this town 43 years. He gestured with his spoon toward Scout. That's good stock. German line. Yes, sir. Czech German working lines. He was born at Lackland. Walter nodded appreciatively. Military knows their dogs. You staying long? Mason hesitated, uncertain how to answer when he didn't know himself. Just passing through. Work where I can find it. Walter's expression suggested he'd heard such things before. Funny thing about Cedar Falls, people who are just passing through tend to stay. Something in the water. Or the mountains. He glanced toward the window where darkness had erased the view, leaving only the reflection of the warm room. Place has a way of keeping folks it decides belong here. At the stove, Vivian paused in her stirring eyes, flicking briefly to Mason before returning to her task. The moment passed so quickly he might have imagined it, but her expression had held something like recognition. Not of him personally, but of something Walter had said. The couple across from Mason finished their meal and excused themselves, nodding polite goodnights. The young woman with the laptop followed shortly after. As the room emptied, Vivian brought a mug of coffee and sat in the chair adjacent to Mason. "How'd you come to my lodge, Mr. Reynolds?" Her question was direct but not unfriendly. "Samuel's been gone 5 years now, and we don't get many visitors who don't have family connections." Mason retrieved the letter from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. "This came 2 weeks ago. No idea why." He studied her face as she read it, looking for signs of surprise or confirmation. Vivian's expression remained neutral, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the paper. "Samuel was particular about things, always had reasons, even if they weren't obvious to anyone else." She handed the letter back. Room 3 was his project room. Kept it locked most of the time. Project room. "My husband was an engineer, structural mostly, but he dabbled in everything. Had theories about the mountain, the weather, how buildings should work with nature instead of against it." A fondness softened her voice. Most folks thought he was eccentric. Maybe he was. Walter, who had been listening silently, chimed in. "Samuel Harper saved this town more than once with his eccentricities. Designed a drainage system that kept Main Street from washing away in '87. Reinforced the community center roof before the big snow of '92 that collapsed half the buildings in town." He directed this to Mason. "Man knew things before they happened. Called it science. Others called it intuition. Either way, he was usually right." Mason absorbed this connecting dots in his mind. "And he left me his room." "Why?" Vivian shook her head. "Samuel had his ways. Might be he saw something in public records, military service list. Might be something else." She rose, collecting empty bowls with practiced efficiency. "Whatever the reason, room 3 is yours for as long as you needed it, Mr. Reynolds. Samuel wanted it that way." Later, back in the room, Mason sat on the edge of the bed, boots still on mine, working through the strange circumstances. Nothing about this situation made sense. People didn't leave rooms to strangers without reason. The floorboard had gone quiet, but Scout still glanced at it occasionally, as if expecting it to speak again. Mason moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. The mountains loomed massive and ancient, their snow-covered peaks glowing silver under the three-quarter moon. The frozen lake stretched out below, a mirror of pale light. Beyond that, the small cluster of lights that was Cedar Falls proper twinkled like earthbound stars. A sound from the hallway caught his attention, soft footsteps, then a gentle tap at his door. When he opened it, he found Lisa again, this time clutching a book to her chest. "Mom said I should apologize for bothering you earlier," she said, not sounding particularly sorry. "But I wanted to show you this." She held up the book, a worn children's volume titled The Mountain's Voice. "My mom found it in the attic when we moved here last year. It's about a mountain that talks to people through bells and pipes." She opened to a dog-eared page showing a simple illustration of a bearded man placing his ear to the ground while a dog sat alertly beside him. "See, just like your dog was doing." Mason took the book, carefully studying the illustration. The resemblance to Scout's posture was uncanny. "Where did your mom find this?" "In a box of old stuff Mrs. Harper said we could have. There's an inscription, see?" She flipped to the front page where faded handwriting read, "For Lisa who will hear the mountain when others cannot. S.H." Mason stared at the initials. S.H. Samuel Harper. Lisa shrugged. "I guess. Weird thing is I wasn't even born when he wrote this, and my name was already in it." Her eyes widened with the delicious mystery of it all. "Mom says it's a coincidence, but I think it's fate." She reclaimed the book. "Anyway, I just wanted to show you. Good night." She skipped down the hallway before Mason could respond. He closed the door slowly, turning the encounter over in his mind. Samuel Harper, leaving a book for a girl not yet born with her exact name. Leaving a room to a stranger with no explanation. The floor that tapped like a heartbeat. Mason returned to the mysterious section of flooring. This time, instead of just pressing, he knelt and examined the edges of the planks, looking for any sign of modification. The third board from the wall seemed slightly different, the grain pattern interrupted in a way that wouldn't be noticeable unless you were looking for it. He retrieved a pocket knife from his duffel and carefully wedged the blade into the nearly invisible seam at the board's edge. With gentle pressure, he felt rather than heard a soft click as something released. The board loosened. Heart quickening, Mason worked his fingers under the edge and lifted. The cavity beneath was small but deliberately constructed, lined with copper that gleamed dully in the room's low light. Inside lay a tin box wrapped in oilcloth, the metal rubbed smooth at the corners by handling. Mason lifted it carefully, feeling its surprising weight. Scout moved closer, sniffing the box with deep concentration before sitting down, tail low, posture alert. Not fear but recognition, as if he'd been waiting for this discovery. Mason sat on the bed, unwrapping the oilcloth slowly to reveal engravings on the lid SH, the same initials confirming his suspicion. He inhaled deeply, then opened the box. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, edges worn smooth, the smell of old paper and mountain air rising from its pages. Beneath the journal, folded carefully, was a brittle blueprint, the lines drawn with precision in faded blue ink. It showed what appeared to be the lodge's foundation, but with an intricate system of copper pipes extending outward into the surrounding land, up into the mountain-like arteries. "What are you, Bissum?" Mason murmured, carefully unfolding the blueprint. The design was unlike anything he'd seen, part architectural drawing, part something else entirely. The copper lines formed patterns that reminded him of sound wave diagrams, with nodes at specific points along the mountain slope. Mason opened the journal to the first page. Samuel Winthrop Harper. It read, followed by a date 15 years earlier, and then a single line. "For whoever lives in the quiet long enough to hear truth in wood and winter." He thumbed through a few pages, finding detailed notes, calculations, and observations about the mountain weather patterns in something called resonance points. Samuel's handwriting was precise but urgent, the pen sometimes pressing so hard it left indentations in subsequent pages. One passage caught Mason's eye. "The mountain speaks before it moves. Copper carries vibration, like bones carry weather. If we listen correctly, we need never fear what comes." The sound of footsteps in the hall prompted Mason to quickly replace the journal in the box. Scout's ears pricked forward, but his posture remained relaxed, not a threat. A soft knock, then Vivian's voice. "Mr. Reynolds, I brought extra blankets. The temperature's dropping tonight." Mason tucked the tin box under the bed before opening the door. Vivian stood with a stack of quilts, her expression unreadable, as she glanced past him to the lifted floorboard. "I see you found it." Her voice held no surprise, only quiet acknowledgement. "I didn't mean to pry, ma'am." Vivian shook her head, placing the quilts on the dresser. "If you weren't meant to find it, you wouldn't have." She moved to the open cavity in the floor, kneeling with a grace that belied her age. Her fingers traced the copper lining. "Samuel said the right person would find it within their first day. The floor only speaks to certain people." Mason watched her questions multiplying. "What is all this? The blueprints, the journal, what was your husband building?" "A warning system." Vivian stood brushing dust from her skirt. "Samuel believed the mountain and the lodge were connected, that with the right system he could feel when the mountain was restless." She glanced toward the window, toward the dark mass of peaks beyond. "This town has lost people to avalanches, floods, mudslides. Samuel thought that was unnecessary, that the mountain always gives warnings if you know how to listen." Scout moved to Vivian's side, pressing his head against her hand in an unusual display of affection. She smiled faintly, scratching behind his ears. "Your dog understands. Animals always did. It was people Samuel struggled to convince." Mason retrieved the tin box, holding it out to her. "This belongs to you." Vivian made no move to take it. "No, it belongs to whoever the floor chose to reveal it to." She gestured to the cavity. "That's been sealed since Samuel died. 5 years, Mr. Reynolds. People have stayed in this room, hikers, tourists, even friends. Not one of them heard what you and Scout heard today." Mason felt a prickle of unease, mixed with a strange sense of recognition. "I'm just a construction worker looking for a quiet place to regroup, Mrs. Harper. I'm not whatever your husband was looking for." Samuel was a combat engineer in Vietnam before he was anything else. Vivian's words landed with quiet impact. "He said war teaches men to listen differently, to notice patterns others miss, to trust instinct when instruments fail." Her eyes sharp with intelligence held Mason's. Sound familiar? Before Mason could respond, a commotion erupted downstairs, voices raised in greeting and the front door opening and closing repeatedly. The quiet lodge had suddenly come alive with activity. Vivian's expression lightened. The festival committee, I forgot they were meeting tonight. She moved toward the door. Westminster Reynolds, there's time for the rest tomorrow. At the threshold, she paused. Oh, and the Northern Bell Festival begins tomorrow afternoon. The whole town participates. You and Scout would be welcome. After she left, Mason sat heavily on the bed, the tin box, a weight in his hands, heavier than its physical mass. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, fat flakes drifting past the window in the yellow pool of light from the porch below. The mountain loomed invisible now in darkness, but present in its massive silence. Mason replaced the journal and blueprints in the box, then returned it to its copper-lined cavity. He left the floorboard loose. Somehow it felt wrong to seal it away again. Scout settled near the spot, not anxious but watchful, as if standing guard over something precious. The digital clock on the bedside table read 9:17 p.m. Mason hadn't felt this exhausted, this bone-deep tired in months. Not the ragged fatigue of insomnia that had plagued him since returning from his last tour, but something cleaner, like after a day of honest work. He removed his boots and stretched out on the bed, not bothering to undress further. Scout's soft whine drew his attention. The dog was looking toward the loose floorboard again, head tilted, ears forward. Mason held his breath, listening. For a moment, nothing. Then so faint he almost missed it, a vibration. Not a tap this time, but a hum, like the lowest note of a distant bell traveling through earth and wood. I hear it, Mason whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Scout or to whoever was sending the sound. The vibration continued for several seconds, then faded to silence. Scout circled once, then settled on the rug beside the bed, closer to Mason than he usually slept. His amber eyes remained fixed on the floor cavity for a long moment before slowly closing. Mason stared at the ceiling, mind racing despite his exhaustion. Nothing about this situation made sense, yet something about it felt inevitable, as if he'd been moving toward this moment his entire life without knowing it. Samuel Harper, a combat engineer like himself. The copper system, the listening floor, the mountain that spoke. The girl with the book that bore her name before she was born. Sleep came eventually, deep and dreamless for the first time in years. No desert firefights, no falling buildings, no faceless pursuers. Just darkness and the distant sense of something vast and patient, watching, waiting, listening back. Morning arrived with pale winter light filtering through frost-etched windows. Mason woke to the smell of coffee and baking bread wafting up from below and the sound of Scout whining softly at the door. He checked his watch, 6:15 a.m. Earlier than he'd intended to rise, but his body had always kept military time despite his best efforts to reprogram it. The floorboard remained open, the copper lining catching the morning light like a dull flame. No sounds came from it now, but Mason found himself listening anyway, attuned to the lodge's subtle language of creaks and sighs as it warmed in the new day. Downstairs, the dining room buzzed with more activity than the previous evening. Walter Thompson occupied the same chair now with a newspaper spread beside his coffee mug. The middle-aged couple had been joined by another, all four dressed in hiking gear despite the snow. The young woman with the laptop was absent, but several new faces had appeared, a family with teenage children at one end of the table and a bearded man in flannel at the other, all helping themselves from platters of eggs, bacon, and toast. Vivian moved efficiently between kitchen and dining room, refilling coffee cups and clearing empty plates. She acknowledged Mason with a nod. Help yourself, Mr. Reynolds. Coffee's hot, food's on the sideboard. A dark-haired woman emerged from the kitchen carrying a basket of fresh rolls, the source of the heavenly aroma that had reached his room. Her resemblance to Lisa was unmistakable, the same almond-shaped eyes and heart-shaped face, though the mother's expression held a weariness the daughters lacked. She wore flour-dusted jeans and a green sweater, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Rosa Mendez, she introduced herself, setting the basket on the table. You met my daughter last night, I hear. I hope she wasn't too much trouble. No trouble, Mason assured her, helping himself to coffee. She seems perceptive. Rosa's smile tightened slightly. That's one word for it. Imaginative is another. She glanced toward the kitchen. Lisa sees patterns everywhere since her father died, makes up stories to explain them. Her tone held no judgment, only a mother's concern. The book she showed me about the mountain, Rosa nodded, found it in a box of old books Mrs. Harper gave us. Strange coincidence with her name, but Lisa took it as a sign. She lowered her voice. Between us, I think Mrs. Harper put it there on purpose. She's been kind to Lisa, encourages her creativity. Her expression softened with gratitude. This place has been good for us. Lisa was so withdrawn after we lost Miguel. Here she's come alive again. Mason nodded, understanding more than he could express. Places held power. Environments shaped healing. He'd seen it in other veterans, how some thrived in city anonymity, while others needed the steady rhythms of rural life to find their center again. The front door of the lodge opened, bringing a gust of cold air and the sound of boots stomping snow from their treads. A man entered with the confident stride of someone who expected doors to open for him. Tall, impeccably groomed, with dark blonde hair combed back from a high forehead, he wore a navy pea coat over pressed slacks and leather boots unscarred by actual labor. His gray-blue eyes, cold as the lake in January, scanned the room with calculating efficiency. Conversation hushed. Walter's newspaper lowered. Rosa's spine straightened as if bracing for impact. Even Scout, lying quietly by Mason's chair, lifted his head, a low rumble of warning vibrating in his chest. Vivian emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. Her expression remained neutral, but Mason noted how her fingers gripped the cloth a fraction tighter. "Mr. Blackwell, you're out early today." Vivian. The man's voice matched his appearance, polished, controlled, with a practiced warmth that never reached his eyes. "Just checking in on Cedar Falls' favorite landmark. The festival committee tells me you've agreed to host the opening ceremony tomorrow. On the front lawn only, same as every year." Vivian's tone held a firm boundary. Gavin Blackwell smiled, revealing perfect teeth. "Of course, tradition is important." His gaze swept the room, noting Mason with a slight narrowing of the eyes before moving on. "I've taken the liberty of having my team clear your driveway and walkways. Can't have anyone slipping during the ceremony." The offer of help came wrapped in the implication that the lodge's maintenance was lacking. "Walter already handled it," Vivian replied evenly, "but thank you." An awkward silence followed, broken by the arrival of Lisa, who bounded down the stairs in purple snow boots and a matching hat. She stopped abruptly at the sight of Blackwell, her usual exuberance dimming. "Morning, Mr. Blackwell," she said with uncharacteristic formality. Blackwell nodded to the child. "Lisa, excited for the festival?" His attempt at warmth fell flat, like an actor who hadn't quite learned his lines. "Yes, sir. I'm helping hang the bells this year." Lisa edged around him toward the dining room, then brightened upon seeing Mason and Scout. "You're up. Are you coming to the festival?" "Everyone comes. There's bells and lanterns, and Mrs. Whitaker makes hot chocolate with real vanilla beans, and—" "Lisa," Rosa interrupted gently, "let Mr. Reynolds have his breakfast." Lisa subsided, but not before whispering loudly to Mason, "You should definitely come. The mountain listens during the Bell Festival." Blackwell's expression hardened momentarily before smoothing into a practiced smile. "Children and their imaginations." He turned back to Vivian. "My offer still stands, Vivian. Evergreen Lodge has served this community faithfully, but it's time to think about the future. Cedar Falls deserves world-class accommodations to match its world-class views." Vivian crossed her arms. "And as I've told you repeatedly, Gavin, this lodge isn't for sale. Not to you, not to anyone. Everything has a price." Blackwell's gaze drifted to the ceiling beams, where hairline cracks spiderweb wound through the ancient wood. Even sentiment. With a curt nod to the room, he departed, leaving the door open behind him. Cold air rushed in until Walter rose to close it. Conversation gradually resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. Mason felt the weight of unspoken history filling the space Blackwell had occupied. He caught Walter's eye across the room, raising an eyebrow in silent question. Walter sighed, folding his newspaper deliberately. "Gavin Blackwell runs Blackwell Development. Been trying to buy up half the town for years. Wants to turn Cedar Falls into the next Aspen." "Not all change is bad," one of the hikers offered, then wilted under Walter's withering glare. "Change that preserves what matters is fine," the old carpenter replied. "Blackwell wants to erase what makes this place special and replace it with something that could be anywhere." He looked to Vivian. His father was the same. Robert Blackwell nearly foreclosed on half the businesses in town during the recession of '89. Vivian nodded, a shadow crossing her features, including this lodge. Samuel and Robert had history. Mason absorbed this, adding another piece to the puzzle. Generational conflict, old grudges, the classic story of tradition versus development that played out in small towns across America. But something about Blackwell's intensity, the almost desperate edge beneath his polished veneer, suggested deeper stakes. Breakfast concluded and the dining room gradually emptied as guests departed for various activities. Mason found himself alone with Vivian as she cleared the last of the dishes. This festival, he began, helping stack plates despite her protests. What exactly is it? Vivian's expression warmed. The Northern Bell Festival dates back to the town's founding in 1898, started as a way for the logging community to celebrate surviving another winter. She carried dishes to the kitchen, continuing as Mason followed with cups and silverware. Bells symbolize vigilance, the way early settlers would ring warnings for avalanches or fires. They hang them throughout town, light lanterns ring in the spring. And Samuel was involved. Vivian smiled, a private expression tinged with both pride and sorrow. Samuel loved the festival. He saw meaning in things others dismissed as superstition, the way sound travels through different materials, how mountains settle and shift. She began washing dishes, her movements methodical. He built a special bell stand on the ridge behind the lodge. Said it was positioned exactly where the mountain could hear it best. Mason leaned against the counter, thinking of the blueprints with their copper lines extending into the mountainside. You really believe the mountain listens? Vivian's hands stilled in the soapy water. What I believe is that Samuel understood things the rest of us missed. He predicted 3 major weather events that saved lives in this town. She looked up at Mason, her gaze steady. Call it science, call it intuition. The results spoke for themselves. Before Mason could respond, a commotion erupted from the front of the lodge, raised voices, the door banging open, boots pounding across the wooden floor. Walter appeared in the kitchen doorway, face flushed with cold and urgency. Vivian, they need help at the festival grounds. The ice sculpture platform collapsed. No one's hurt, but it's a mess, and the ceremony's tomorrow. Vivian quickly dried her hands. I'll get my coat. Mason found himself speaking without conscious decision. I can help. I've got construction experience. Walter's relief was visible. Good man, we need every hand we can get. He glanced at Scout. Your partner welcome too. Town's crawling with strangers for the festival, could use a good set of eyes. 20 minutes later, Mason found himself in the center of Cedar Falls, surrounded by organized chaos. The town square had been transformed for the festival, with wooden stalls arranged in concentric circles around a central platform. Evergreen garlands draped between lampposts and paper lanterns in blue and white hung from every available surface. Volunteers hustled about, hanging bells of various sizes from designated points, while others assembled heating stations and food service areas. The collapsed platform lay at the center, a wooden structure meant to support ice sculptures that had buckled under the weight of newly delivered ice blocks. Several men were already attempting to salvage what they could, but their efforts lacked coordination. Mason assessed the situation with practiced efficiency. We need to stabilize the base first, then rebuild the support structure with proper load distribution. He turned to Walter. Have you got timber 2x6s at minimum? Walter nodded toward a stack of lumber covered with tarp near the gazebo. Town keeps building supplies for emergencies. Help yourself. For the next 3 hours, Mason worked alongside Walter and a rotating crew of volunteers rebuilding the platform with reinforced cross-bracing and strategic weight distribution. Scout patrolled the perimeter, occasionally returning to check on Mason, but mostly maintaining a watchful presence that seemed to reassure the townsfolk. The work felt good, simple, physical, with clear objectives and visible results. Mason found his mind quieting the persistent background noise of anxiety fading beneath the rhythm of hammers and saws. This was what he'd been missing since leaving the service, since losing his construction job. Purpose, community, the satisfaction of building something lasting. Around noon, Rosa appeared with Lisa in tow, bearing a basket of sandwiches and thermoses of coffee for the workers. Lisa immediately gravitated to Mason, watching with undisguised fascination as he secured the final supports. You're really good at fixing things, she observed, handing him a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Like Mr. Harper was. Mason accepted the food with a nod of thanks. I've had practice. Is that why the mountain called you here to fix things? The question delivered with a child's blunt curiosity caught Mason off guard. The mountain didn't call me, Lisa. I got a letter about a room for rent. Lisa rolled her eyes with the magnificent condescension only a 9-year-old could muster. That's just how it works. The mountain doesn't send text messages. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. It talks through the bells and the pipes, and sometimes through dreams. Mason unwrapped his sandwich, buying time to formulate a response that wouldn't outright dismiss her, but also wouldn't encourage what seemed like an unhealthy fantasy. Your mom mentioned you found that book with your name in it. Pretty unusual coincidence. It's not a coincidence. Mrs. Harper says there's no such thing. Lisa sat on a nearby bench swinging her legs. Mr. Harper knew I was coming. He left messages for lots of people who weren't here yet. Her gaze suddenly serious beyond her years fixed on Mason. Like you. Before Mason could press further, a familiar voice cut through the square. Gavin Blackwell had arrived surrounded by a small entourage of assistants, clutching tablets and phones. He strode directly to the platform, examining the reconstruction with critical eyes. This won't do, he announced to no one in particular. The viewing angles are all wrong. The VIPs won't be able to see properly from the designated area. He gestured toward a roped-off section near the gazebo. Walter stepped forward, wiping his hands on his work pants. The platform is structurally sound now, Gavin. That's what matters. Aesthetics matter too, Walter. This festival is Cedar Falls' chance to showcase its potential to investors. Blackwell's gaze landed on Mason, narrowing slightly. I don't believe we've been formally introduced. You're staying at Vivian's place. Mason straightened, measuring the man with a glance. Mason Reynolds, just passing through. Yet here you are rebuilding our festival platform. Blackwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. How civic-minded of you. Scout appeared at Mason's side, positioning himself between the two men, his posture alert but non-aggressive. Blackwell's gaze dropped to the dog, something like wariness flickering across his features. Military dog, he observed. Impressive, though perhaps not the safest addition to a crowded festival. The concern in his voice was belied by the calculation in his eyes. People with PTSD and their service animals can be unpredictable. The implication hung in the air, deliberate and pointed. Mason felt heat rise at the back of his neck, but years of discipline held his expression neutral. Scouts fully trained and certified. As am I. Lisa suddenly appeared beside them, small face fierce with indignation. Scout's a hero, and Mr. Reynolds saved the whole festival by fixing the platform. She planted herself firmly beside the dog, one hand resting protectively on his back. Mr. Harper said he would come. Silence fell across the square. Workers paused, conversations halted. Vivian, who had been directing volunteers near the gazebo, turned sharply toward them. Blackwell's confident expression faltered momentarily. What did you say? Lisa lifted her chin, defiant. Mr. Harper told me in my dreams. He said someone would come who could hear the mountain like he did. She looked up at Mason. Someone with a special dog who knows things. Rosa hurried over, face flushed with embarrassment. Lisa, honey, what have I told you about your stories? She placed her hands on her daughter's shoulders, giving Mason an apologetic glance. I'm so sorry. She has such an active imagination. Blackwell recovered his composure, offering a condescending smile. Children and their fantasies, though I'd be careful about encouraging this particular one, Mrs. Mendez. His gaze flicked meaningfully toward Lisa. Blurring the line between dreams and reality can be problematic. The threat, thinly veiled, hung in the cold air. Rosa's arms tightened protectively around her daughter. Mason stepped forward, intentionally breaking the tension by addressing Walter. The platform's ready for the ice now. Where should we start unloading? Grateful for the redirection, Walter began organizing the ice delivery, and the square gradually returned to its previous activity. Blackwell, after a final measuring look at Mason and Scout, rejoined his entourage, issuing directions about lighting and sound systems. Vivian approached once Blackwell had moved out of earshot, her expression troubled. I see you've met Gavin properly now. Friendly guy, Mason replied dryly. Vivian's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. He's desperate. The resort project is leveraged to the hilt from what I hear. If he can't acquire the properties he needs, including my lodge, his investors will pull out. She glanced toward where Blackwell stood, gesturing emphatically to a technician. Desperation makes men dangerous, Mr. Reynolds. Mason thought of the tin box hidden beneath his floor, the copper system extending into the mountain, the strange coincidences that seemed to be mounting by the hour. What does Blackwell want with the lodge, specifically? There's plenty of land around here. Location, partly. The view, the lake access. Vivian hesitated, then added quietly, and spite. Robert Blackwell tried to foreclose on Samuel years ago during a financial downturn. Samuel found a way to save not just our lodge, but half a dozen other businesses in town. The Blackwells have long memories. Scout suddenly stiffened beside them, ears pricked forward, a low whine rising in his throat. He turned toward the mountains, body alert, nose testing the air. What is it, boy? Mason knelt beside his, following his gaze to the snow-covered peaks beyond the town. Nothing seemed amiss. The mountains stood silent and magnificent against the clear blue sky, eternal sentinels over the valley. Yet Scout remained tense, his attention unwavering. A moment later, Mason felt it, the faintest tremor beneath his feet, so subtle he might have imagined it. Like a deep breath taken by the earth itself, a shifting so gentle, it registered more as intuition than sensation. Vivian had gone very still, her eyes on the mountains. Did you feel that? Mason nodded slowly. What was it? Samuel called them mountain whispers, micro tremors, usually harmless, but she trailed off, her expression growing distant. He always said they were the mountain's way of testing the listener. Scout relaxed gradually, the tension flowing out of his body like water. He looked up at Mason, amber eyes holding a question no human language could formulate. The festival begins tomorrow at sunset. Vivian said, her voice taking on a new urgency. You should come. There's something you need to see. She glanced toward the northern ridge where the lodge perched. Something Samuel left that might make more sense to you than it ever did to me. As the afternoon sun began its descent behind the mountains, casting long purple shadows across the valley, Mason felt a growing certainty that Cedar Falls was far more than a temporary stop on his journey. Whatever had drawn him here, coincidence, fate, or something less easily named, was not finished with him yet. The mountain stood patient and ancient against the darkening sky, keeping its secrets for now. But Mason had the unsettling sense that it was watching, waiting, perhaps even listening, and that soon, very soon, it would speak again. The Northern Bell Festival transformed Cedar Falls as darkness settled over the mountain valley. Paper lanterns in blue and white hung from every storefront, swaying gently in the evening breeze. Wooden bells of various sizes, some small as child's fist, others large as wagon wheels, adorned doorways and lampposts, their polished surfaces gleaming in the warm glow of string lights. The festival grounds hummed with activity as vendors arranged their stalls and musicians tuned instruments on a small stage near the rebuilt platform. Mason stood at the edge of the crowd, Scout at his side, watching the proceedings with an outsider's curiosity. The townsfolk moved with the comfortable familiarity of people enacting a ritual performed countless times before each person, knowing their role without instruction. Children darted between adults' faces painted with blue swirls meant to represent mountain spirits. Teenagers hung elaborate bell mobiles from the gazebo rafters, laughing as they tangled strings and bumped shoulders. Walter approached, offering Mason a carved wooden bell on a leather cord. Everyone wears one, tradition. The small bell gleamed with fresh oil, its surface etched with a simple mountain outline. Mason accepted it, feeling the surprising weight of the dense wood as he slipped the cord over his head. The bell settled against his chest with an unexpected warmth, as if it had absorbed heat from Walter's hands. What's the significance? Walter gestured toward the mountains looming dark against the star-filled sky. Old settlers believed wearing bells during the spring thaw kept the mountain's attention focused on the town, warned of avalanches, floods, anything coming down from above. He adjusted his own larger bell, worn and polished by years of handling. Most folks see it as quaint superstition now, good for tourism. A hush fell over the crowd as Mayor Caldwell stepped onto the central platform. Short and round with thick glasses perched on a bulbous nose, he projected an air of practiced importance as he raised his hands for silence. Behind him, Gavin Blackwell stood with his entourage, his tailored wool coat and leather gloves, marking him as separate from the fleece and flannel that dominated the crowd. The mayor cleared his throat. Citizens of Cedar Falls, honored guests, welcome to the 125th Annual Northern Bell Festival. Applause rippled through the gathering. For generations, our community has marked the transition from winter to spring with this celebration of vigilance, community, and renewal. Tonight, we honor those traditions while looking toward a bright future. His gaze shifted meaningfully toward Blackwell, a future that respects our heritage while embracing progress. And now, to officially begin our festival, Mrs. Vivian Harper will ring the ceremonial first bell as her family has done for 73 years. Vivian ascended the steps slowly, her silver hair gleaming in the lantern light. She wore a deep green dress with a silver shawl draped around her shoulders, formal but practical against the evening chill. In her hand, she carried an ornate brass bell on a curved wooden handle, its surface etched with intricate patterns that caught and reflected the light. The crowd fell silent as she raised the bell above her head. For a moment, she stood motionless, eyes closed as if in prayer or remembrance. Then, with a single fluid motion, she swung the bell in a perfect arc. The sound rang out clear and bright, a pure tone that seemed to hang in the cold air longer than physics should allow. It resonated across the square, echoing off buildings and carrying into the darkness beyond the town limits. Something in the quality of that sound, its depth, its perfect clarity, sent a shiver down Mason's spine. Scout's ears pricked forward, head tilting in focused attention. As the note faded, a curious thing happened. From throughout the town, other bells began to sound, some rung by waiting. Citizens, others seemingly stirred by the breeze alone. The combined effect created a rippling chorus that moved like a wave through Cedar Falls building, in intensity until it seemed the entire valley rang with overlapping tones. Then, just as the sound reached its peak, a deeper note answered from somewhere in the distance. Not a bell, not a human-made sound at all, but a resonant hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It lasted only seconds, so brief Mason might have imagined it, but Scout's sudden alertness confirmed he had heard it too. The festival erupted into cheers and music, people moving toward food stalls and activity areas, but Mason remained rooted in place, scanning the mountains with narrowed eyes. Vivian appeared at his side, the ceremonial bell now hanging from a cord at her waist. "You heard it?" Not a question, but a confirmation. Mason nodded. "What was that?" Vivian's gaze remained fixed on the dark peaks. "Samuel called it the mountain's answer. Said the right bell tone at the right location could create a harmonic response in the rock itself." Her voice lowered. "Most people think it's just echo or imagination. Those who hear it clearly are rare." She gestured toward a path leading away from the festival grounds. "There's something you need to see." Mason hesitated, glancing back at the celebration now in full swing. Lisa waved excitedly from where she helped her mother serve pastries, her hands sticky with sugar glaze. Walter nodded encouragingly from near the musician's stage. Despite having arrived only yesterday, Mason felt unexpected connections forming tendrils of belonging, taking root in unfamiliar soil. Vivian led Mason and Scout along a snow-packed trail that wound behind the town and up toward Evergreen Lodge. They walked in silence, their breath forming clouds in the cold air, boots crunching on the frozen path. The festival sounds gradually faded behind them, replaced by the hushed stillness of the winter forest. Instead of turning toward the lodge, Vivian veered onto a narrower trail that switched back up the mountain slope. 20 minutes of steady climbing brought them to a small clearing on a rocky outcropping. The spot offered a sweeping view of Cedar Falls below, now a constellation of colored lights in the valley darkness. In the center of the clearing stood a structure unlike anything Mason had seen before. A wooden platform weathered by years of exposure supported what appeared to be a massive copper bell, mounted on an intricate framework of metal and wood. The bell itself was unusual, not the traditional shape, but more cylindrical, with openings cut in precise patterns around its circumference. Copper tubes of varying diameters extended from its base, disappearing into the rocky ground below. Vivian approached the structure reverently. Samuel built this the year before he died, worked on it for months, mostly at night. Her fingers traced one of the copper tubes. People thought he was building an elaborate wind chime. Only I knew what it really was. Mason examined the construction with engineer's eyes, noting the precise angles, the careful calibration of the support structure, the way each tube was positioned to align with something below the surface. Part of the warning system in his blueprints. Vivian nodded. "The central node. From here, the copper network extends down into the mountain, connecting to the lines beneath the lodge." She pointed to various rock formations around the clearing. Each of those markers indicates a junction point where the copper pipes branch off toward different areas of risk avalanche zones, flood paths, unstable slopes. Scout circled the structure, sniffing with intense concentration. He paused at certain points and ears pricked forward before moving on to the next. His behavior reminded Mason of explosive detection patterns, methodical and purposeful. Vivian watched the dog with approval. Samuel always said animals understood instantly what took humans years to learn. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object, a brass striker polished by frequent handling. During the festival, Samuel would come here after the ceremonial bell and listen for the mountain's response. She extended the striker toward Mason. "I think you should try." Mason took the tool, its weight familiar yet strange in his palm. The metal felt unusually warm despite the cold night air. "What exactly am I listening for?" Vivian's eyes reflected the distant festival lights. "Samuel said you'd know when you heard it." She stepped back, giving Mason space. He approached the copper bell cautiously. Up close, he could see the intricate engravings covering its surface. Mathematical formulas, geometric patterns, and symbols he didn't recognize, interspersed with what appeared to be topographical lines mapping the surrounding terrain. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, blending precision engineering with something almost artistic. Mason raised the striker and with a decisive motion struck the bell near its upper edge. The sound that emerged defied expectation. Not the bright, clear tone of traditional bells, but a deeper, more complex resonance that seemed to vibrate at multiple frequencies simultaneously. The sound traveled outward but also downward, the copper tubes carrying vibrations into the earth like roots drawing water. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a response came, faint at first, a tremor so subtle Mason felt rather than heard it. A vibration rose through the soles of his boots, traveling up through his body until it seemed to resonate in his chest cavity. The sensation intensified, becoming an audible hum that emerged from the mountain itself, pitched perfectly to harmonize with the bell's fading tone. Scout went completely still, muscles tense, eyes fixed on the ground, as if he could see through rock to whatever stirred below. A shiver that had nothing to do with cold ran down Mason's spine as the response faded, leaving behind a silence more profound than before. It answered. The words escaped in a whisper. Vivian's face held a mixture of vindication and wonder. Samuel was right. She moved closer, her voice gaining intensity. "For 5 years, I've struck that bell during every festival. Not once did I hear a response like that." She looked at Mason with newfound certainty. "The mountain recognizes you." Later that night, Mason sat on the edge of his bed in room 3, the tin box open beside him, Samuel Harper's journal in his hands. Scout lay nearby, occasionally lifting his head to check the loose floorboard, which had remained quiet since their return from the ridge. Mason thumbed through the journal, slowly struggling with Samuel's cramped handwriting and technical terminology. Pages of calculations and diagrams documented the development of the resonance network, as Samuel called it. The engineer had mapped fault lines, water tables, and geological formations throughout the valley, identifying points of potential instability and connecting them with his copper detection system. One passage caught Mason's attention. Copper conducts vibration with minimal distortion over remarkable distances when properly insulated. The mountain speaks through microseismic activity before major events, sometimes hours, sometimes days in advance. Most dismiss these signals as normal settling or geological noise. They are anything but normal. Mason flipped forward, finding entries that documented predicted events, a flash flood in '87 that Samuel had warned the town about 3 days before it occurred, an avalanche on the north face in '91 that changed course unexpectedly, avoiding the ski lodge that had been evacuated based on Samuel's advice, a series of small tremors in '95 that preceded a landslide on the eastern slope. As he neared the end of the journal, the entries became more personal, less technical. The handwriting changed to less precise, more hurried, as if Samuel had been racing against time. Mason paused at an entry dated 3 months before Samuel's death. "I dreamed of the next listener last night. A soldier like I was but younger. Taller, dark hair with early silver, eyes that have seen war but still look for good. Most importantly, he brings a guardian with him. 4 legs for the color of winter sunrise. The dog hears what humans cannot. Mason's pulse quickened. The description was uncomfortably specific down to Scout's unusual coloring. The next entry, dated a week later, continued the theme. The dream came again, clearer this time. The soldier arrives when the mountain grows restless. Spring thaw, but too early. Water where there should be ice. He finds what I've hidden where floorboards speak. The final pages contain technical specifications for modifications to Room 3, the copper lining beneath the loose board, connections to the main network, optimal placement for detection of subtle vibrations. Samuel had designed the room specifically as a listening post, positioning the bed and furniture to maximize exposure to the detection system. A loose paper slipped from between the journal's pages, a handwritten letter in an envelope addressed simply to the listener. Mason hesitated before carefully opening it. If you're reading this, the mountain has chosen you as it once chose me. I don't know your name or when you'll arrive, but I know why you're here. Soldiers recognize patterns civilians miss. We feel danger before we see it. The mountain needs those skills. Cedar Falls faces threats beyond what conventional warning systems detect. The resonance network I've built is incomplete. You'll need to finish it. The blueprints show what remains to be done. The mountain will guide you if you listen. Trust the dog. Animals hear frequencies humans can't detect. Your companion will alert you to signals you might miss. Watch for Blackwell. Robert's son will continue what his father started, attempting to develop land that should remain undisturbed. Some places aren't meant for human control. Most importantly, when the early thaw comes and water runs where ice should hold, don't hesitate. Act decisively even when others doubt. Lives depend on it. The mountain chose you for a reason. It never makes mistakes. Samuel Harper, Combat Engineer, 25th Infantry Division. Mason refolded the letter slowly, mind racing. The coincidences had become too specific, too numerous to dismiss. Either Samuel Harper had been eerily prescient or something larger was at work, something Mason's rational mind struggled to categorize. Scout suddenly lifted his head, ears forward, eyes focused on the window. Mason followed his gaze but saw only darkness beyond the glass. Then he felt it, the faintest vibration through the floorboards, like the echo of the mountain's earlier response, but subtly different in frequency and duration. This wasn't communication. It was warning. The next morning dawned unnaturally warm. Mason woke to the sound of dripping water icicles melting outside his window, releasing steady drops that tapped against the sill. The temperature had risen overnight, bringing the kind of false spring that mountain regions sometimes experience before winter's final assault. The dining room buzzed with conversation about the weather as guests enjoyed breakfast. The hikers debated changing their route to avoid potentially unstable snow on the higher trails. Walter mentioned the early melt would mean starting flood preparations sooner than usual. Through it all, Mason noticed Vivian moving with increased efficiency, checking windows, making notes about roof conditions, preparing for whatever the sudden warmth might bring. After breakfast, Mason sought out Walter. Is there access to the basement? I'd like to see more of the lodge's structure. Walter's weathered face creased with knowing lines. Vivian said you might ask. Come on. He led Mason to a door beside the kitchen, unlocking it with an iron key from his pocket. Samuel treated this place like his personal laboratory. Used to spend hours down there, especially during weather transitions. The stairs descended into darkness until Walter flipped a switch, revealing a basement, unlike anything Mason had expected. While the upper floors of Evergreen Lodge maintained rustic simplicity, the basement was a workshop that would make any engineer proud. Workbenches lined the walls, their surfaces covered with tools, electronic components, and partially assembled devices. Metal shelving held labeled boxes of supplies, copper fittings, insulation materials, sensors of various types. But most striking was the network of pipes emerging from the foundation walls. Copper tubes of varying diameters converged near the center of the room, where they connected to what appeared to be a custom-built monitoring station. Gauges, dials, and what Mason recognized as early seismic detection equipment covered a large panel, though most appeared inactive. Samuel's life work, Walter gestured to the complex system. Copper resonance network, he called it. Pipes extend from here up the mountain to that bell station you visited last night, and to dozens of other monitoring points throughout the valley. Mason examined the control panel, noting the craftsmanship and ingenuity behind its design. This is remarkable engineering for one man working alone. Walter nodded. Samuel was Army Corps of Engineers before settling here. Applied everything he learned about structural monitoring, vibration analysis, and early warning systems. He ran a hand along one of the main copper tubes. System work, too, predicted three major events that could have been devastating for the town. Mason followed the largest pipe to where it disappeared into the concrete floor. These connects to the lines under room 3. That room was Samuel's primary listening post. Said something about the geological formation directly beneath it created ideal conditions for detecting certain frequencies. Walter moved to a large blueprint pinned to the wall, a detailed map of Cedar Falls and the surrounding mountains with a copper network overlaid in red ink. He mapped every fault line, every historical slide path, every flood channel, color-coded by risk level. Mason studied the map with growing appreciation. Samuel Harper had been methodical and thorough, applying military precision to civilian protection. The network extended far beyond what Mason had imagined, with monitoring points placed at strategic locations throughout the valley. Blackwell's development plans, where exactly would they build? Walter's expression darkened. He pointed to a section of the map marked with multiple red lines. Right through the highest risk zone, Samuel documented 6 minor slides in that area over the past century. Blackwell wants to put luxury cabins and a restaurant there. Scout, who had been exploring the basement with curious sniffs, suddenly froze near the main junction box where the copper pipes converged. His posture shifted to high alert, ears forward, tail straight. A low whine built in his throat. Mason moved quickly to his side, placing a hand on the copper pipe. The vibration was subtle but unmistakable, a pulsing rhythm that seemed to travel through the metal from somewhere deep in the mountain. Different from last night's response to the bell. More urgent, less harmonic. Walter joined them, expression grave. That's the warning signal. Samuel charted different vibration patterns, their frequency, duration, intensity. This one means water movement where there shouldn't be. The early thaw, Mason murmured, recalling Samuel's letter. We need to check the mountain. An hour later, Mason and Scout followed a hiking trail that wound up the eastern slope, with Walter leading the way. The temperature continued to rise, turning the packed snow trail into treacherous slush. Water ran in rivulets alongside the path, evidence of rapidly melting snow on the higher elevations. They reached a ridge overlooking a steep ravine. Below what should have been a frozen stream bed was now a swollen channel of muddy water. The rushing current undercut snowbanks along its course, carrying away chunks of ice and soil. Walter pointed to the far slope. That whole face is vulnerable during quick thaws. Soil gets saturated, loses cohesion. In '87, it gave way completely, sent a wall of mud and debris right toward town. Samuel's warning gave us time to build diversion berms. He gestured to earthen structures still visible through melting snow at the ravine's mouth. Saved downtown from being buried. Mason surveyed the terrain with a combat engineer's trained eye, noting the warning signs: water seeping through soil layers, small slumps where the ground wound had already shifted, trees leaning at concerning angles where their root systems were compromised. Scout ranged ahead, following what appeared to be animal trails, but Mason recognized his search pattern. The dog was checking ground stability, using the same techniques he'd been trained for in mine detection. Suddenly, Scout stopped barking sharply 3 times, his alert signal. Mason and Walter hurried to where Scout stood at the edge of what appeared to be solid ground. The dog backed up, barking again. Mason carefully approached, testing with his foot, and found not firm earth, but a thin crust of soil over a hollow space where water had eroded the underlying structure. Sinkhole forming, Walter confirmed grimly. Whole area could go. They continued along the ridge, documenting similar danger spots, with Scout consistently alerting before either man noticed the warning signs. The dog's ability to detect subtle ground shifts proved invaluable as they mapped the most vulnerable areas. By early afternoon, they had compiled enough evidence to justify concern. Multiple drainage paths had formed where water cut through snow and soft earth, all flowing toward the town below. If the warm spell continued, and the weather report predicted it would for at least 3 more days, Cedar Falls faced significant risk. As they descended toward town, the sound of laughter and splashing drew their attention to the frozen lake at the valley's edge. Despite prominent thin ice warnings posted along the shore, several children had ventured onto the ice, delighting in the puddles forming on its surface. Parents watched from the bank, seemingly unconcerned by the dangerous conditions. Walter muttered under his breath, "Every year, same foolishness." Warm day makes people forget winter's not done with us. Mason scanned the group of children, tension building in his chest, as he noted their positions relative to the lake's center where ice would be thinnest. Most stayed close to shore, but one small figure had ventured much farther out, a boy about 8 years old wearing a blue jacket far too light for the conditions, scarf trailing behind him as he spun and slid across the increasingly slushy surface. That kid's too far out. Mason quickened his pace down the trail. They were still 50 yards from shore when it happened. A sharp, brutal crack split the air, the distinctive sound of ice giving way under pressure. The boy's arms flung outward, a startled cry, knifing through the suddenly still atmosphere. Then he vanished, dropped through the ice, as if swallowed whole. Shouts erupted from the shoreline. A woman screamed, her voice high with terror. Parents grabbed their children, pulling them back from the edge, but no one moved toward the broken ice where the boy had disappeared. Mason broke into a run, calculating angles and distances as he moved. Scout shot ahead instinctively, understanding the emergency. Behind him, Walter shouted into a radio calling for emergency services. Mason hit the ice edge at full speed, then immediately dropped to his hands and knees, distributing his weight across the fragile surface. "Stay back," he called to the panicked adults attempting to follow. "The ice won't hold multiple rescuers." He crawled forward, using his elbows and knees to spread his body weight, feeling the ice flex beneath him. 20 feet ahead, the boy surfaced briefly in the jagged hole, gasping for air, small hands clawing desperately at the broken edges. His face had already taken on the gray pallor of extreme cold shock. "I've got you, buddy," Mason called, voice steady despite the adrenaline scorching his veins. "Keep your arms out flat on the ice." Scout reached the hole first, belly low against the ice, spreading his weight just as he'd been trained for thin ice rescues in Afghanistan's mountain regions. The dog inched forward until he reached the hole's edge, then seized the boy's scarf in his teeth, pulling with gentle, steady pressure to keep the child's head above water. Mason reached them seconds later. "Good boy, Scout. Hold him steady." He quickly unwound a coiled rope from inside his coat, a habit from years of field operations, and looped it around his wrist and the boy's forearm. "I've got you now. Don't struggle." The boy's eyes were wide with terror, his breath coming in hitching sobs. "Cold. I know it is, but you're not going under again. Look at me, not the water." Mason locked eyes with the boy, providing a focal point beyond the immediate danger. "What's your name?" "Tyler." "Tyler, I need you to stay very still while I pull." "Can you do that just like a soldier?" The boy managed a jerky nod, his blue-tinged lips trembling uncontrollably. Mason braced his boots against more solid ice behind him and began to pull, using his body weight as counter-leverage. Scout maintained his gentle grip on the scarf, helping stabilize the boy's position. The ice complained beneath them, spiderweb cracks blooming outward, but it held as Mason slowly, steadily extracted Tyler from the freezing water. With a final heave, the boy broke free from the whole water, streaming from his soaked clothes. Mason immediately wrapped him in his own coat, gathering the shivering child against his chest to share body heat. Scout pressed against them both, providing additional warmth. Emergency responders arrived as Mason carried Tyler to shore, where a frantic woman with wind-blown blonde hair rushed forward. "Tyler, oh God, my baby." She reached for her son, sobbing with relief. Mason transferred the boy carefully. "He needs to get warm immediately. Hypothermia sets in fast at his size." Paramedics swarmed around them with thermal blankets and monitoring equipment. The crowd that had gathered parted to allow an emergency vehicle closer to the shore. Among the onlookers, Mason spotted a familiar face, Gavin Blackwell, immaculate in his designer coat, observing the scene with calculated interest. As the paramedics loaded Tyler into the ambulance, Blackwell approached. His gaze flickered between Mason, Scout, and the broken ice beyond. "That was quite the heroic display, Reynolds." His tone suggested something performative about Mason's actions. "Though rather reckless. You could have gone under yourself." Mason wiped lake water from his beard. "Kid didn't have time to wait for proper equipment." Blackwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Lucky for everyone, it worked out. This time." He gestured toward the lake. "Incidents like this highlight why Cedar Falls needs modernization, proper recreational facilities, indoor options during dangerous thaw periods, professional safety staff." His attention shifted to the gathering crowd. A resort development would provide all that, plus jobs and economic security. Mason might have responded, but Scout suddenly went rigid beside him, attention snapping toward the lake. The dog's posture shifted to high alert, a low warning growl building in his throat. Mason followed his gaze just as another crack resonated across the ice louder than before, deeper like a warning knock from beneath the world. This wasn't just surface ice breaking. It was something else, something that made the hair rise on Mason's neck. The lake seemed to shudder, a visible ripple passing across its partially frozen surface. Wind gusted suddenly across the water, though the air had been still moments before. Several onlookers stepped back instinctively, sensing something beyond normal spring thaw dynamics. Even Blackwell paused, eyes narrowing at the unusual phenomenon. For a brief moment, the polished veneer cracked, revealing genuine uncertainty. The moment passed as quickly as it had arrived. The lake settled, the wind died, and the crowd's attention returned to the departing ambulance. But Mason had seen enough to confirm his growing suspicion. Samuel Harper's warning system was registering real threats, and those threats were intensifying. By evening, the rescue at the lake had become the talk of Cedar Falls. Mason found himself receiving grateful nods from townspeople as he walked Scout back to Evergreen Lodge. News traveled quickly in small communities, and by sundown, everyone knew about the stranger and his dog who had saved Tyler Wilson from the ice. Inside the lodge, a different energy hummed. Vivian had mobilized her small staff, moving furniture away from windows, checking roof drainage systems, and organizing emergency supplies. She clearly received Walter's report and understood its implications. Rosa worked alongside her, preparing extra food stores, while Lisa entertained the youngest guests with board games in the dining area. The child caught sight of Mason and Scout entering and ran over, eyes wide with excitement. "You saved Tyler, everyone's talking about it." She bounced on her toes. "Did the mountain tell Scout the ice would break? In my dream, the mountain always warns the special dogs first." Rosa approached with an apologetic smile. Lisa let Mr. Reynolds warm up before bombarding him with questions. She turned to Mason. "Thank you for what you did today. Tyler's mom is a friend. The doctors say he'll be fine, no lasting damage." Her expression grew serious. "But Walter told us about what you found up on the ridge. Is it really that bad?" Mason chose his words carefully, aware of Lisa listening intently. "There's significant snowmelt happening above several drainage channels that lead directly to town. With the forecast showing continued warm temperatures, we should prepare for potential flooding." Vivian joined them, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I've activated our emergency protocols. Guest rooms on the ground floor are being relocated upstairs, valuables moved to secure storage." She glanced toward the window where darkness had erased the view of the mountains. Samuel's notebooks predicted this. Rapid thaw after sustained cold water volume, exceeding drainage capacity. Mason lowered his voice. "Has anyone warned the town council the festival areas are directly in the potential flood path?" Vivian's expression tightened. "Walter's speaking with Mayor Caldwell now. But Blackwell has considerable influence with the council, and he's invested heavily in the festival as a showcase for potential investors." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Vivian opened it to reveal a middle-aged woman with short salt and pepper hair and a police chief's uniform. "Evening, Vivian. Heard you've got our hero staying here." Her sharp eyes found Mason. "Chief Diana Reeves. Wanted to thank you personally for today. That was quick thinking at the lake." Vivian made introductions. Chief Reeves studied Mason with professional assessment. "Walter tells me you have got concerns about the thaw conditions. I'd like to hear them directly." For the next 20 minutes, Mason detailed their observations from the mountain. The saturated soil conditions forming sinkholes accelerated, snowmelt feeding into confined drainage channels. He outlined the potential convergence zones where water flow could intensify, backed by Samuel's documented history of similar events. Chief Reeves listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small pad. When Mason finished, she tucked the pad away with a grim nod. "Matches what our senior rangers have been saying. Problem is, we've got 3,000 visitors in town for the festival, and evacuation creates its own risks." She glanced at Vivian. "Plus, certain influential parties are resistant to any action that might dampen the festival atmosphere." "Blackwell," Vivian stated flatly. Reeves didn't confirm or deny, but her expression spoke volumes. "I've authorized increased monitoring of the upper watersheds and put rescue teams on standby. Best I can do without council approval for more drastic measures." She turned back to Mason. "If you notice any significant changes, call me directly." She handed him a business card. "Any hour, day or night." After Reeves departed, Mason retreated to room 3 with Scout. The loose floorboard near the wall now stayed permanently open, the copper-lined cavity exposed. Mason had positioned his bed closer to it, allowing him to check the system throughout the night. He sat on the floor beside the cavity journal, open in his lap, studying Samuel's notes on vibration patterns and their meanings. Scout lay nearby, ears periodically twitching toward the opening as if listening for distant signals. A soft knock sounded at his door. Mason opened it to find Lisa in pajamas, decorated with stars, clutching her book about the mountain. "Mom's helping Mrs. Harper with emergency preparations. She said I could bring you this." She held out a mug of hot chocolate topped with miniature marshmallows. "For heroes." Mason accepted the mug with a small smile. "Thank you, but I'm not really a hero." Lisa rolled her eyes with magnificent certainty. "You saved Tyler, and you can hear the mountain like Mr. Harper could. That makes you special." She peered past him into the room, spotting the open floorboard. "Did you find the listening place I knew it was in this room?" Before Mason could respond, Lisa darted past him and knelt beside the cavity, peering into it with fascination. "The copper pipes, just like in my dreams." She looked up at Mason, eyes bright with vindication. "See, I told you, the man in the mountain talks through the floors." Mason approached carefully, not wanting to dismiss her experience, but concerned about encouraging what might be unhealthy fantasy. "Lisa, these pipes are part of an early warning system Mr. Harper built. They detect vibrations from the mountain that might signal danger." "I know that," she replied with the patient tone of a child explaining something obvious to a confused adult. "But they're also how he listens and talks." She placed her small hand on the edge of the copper lining. "Sometimes at night I hear him. He says someone special would come who could finish what he started. Someone with a special log." Her gaze moved to Scout, who had approached to sniff her curiously. "I think he meant you." Mason settled on the floor beside her. "Why do you think that—" Lisa opened her book to a dog-eared page showing the illustration of the man and dog listening to the ground. "Because you do this. You listen." She studied Mason with surprising intensity. "Mr. Harper says the mountain has secrets, good ones and scary ones. The pipes help hear both kinds." Scout suddenly lifted his head, ears pricking forward, his attention fixed on the copper cavity body tensing slightly. A moment later, Mason felt a vibration traveling through the floor different from previous patterns. Not the harmonious response to the bell, nor the warning tremors from that afternoon. This was rhythmic, almost like Morse code, a series of pulses that seemed deliberately patterned. Lisa's eyes widened. "He's talking to you." Mason placed his hand directly on the copper, feeling the vibrations more clearly. They came in distinct groups: 3 pulses pause, 2 pulses pause, 3 pulses again. The pattern repeated twice before fading. "What does it mean?" Lisa whispered, face alight with wonder. Mason shook his head slowly. "I'm not sure." But something about the rhythm nagged at his memory. A communication protocol he'd learned during combat engineer training, used when radio silence was necessary, but vibration could travel through solid objects. Later, after Lisa had been called away by her mother, Mason returned to Samuel's journals, searching for any mention of specific vibration patterns. Near the back, he found a crude coding system Samuel had developed based on military protocols, using specific rhythmic sequences to represent different warnings or messages. The pattern Mason had felt translated roughly to water rising, prepared defenses. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, the temperature having risen even further overnight. What had been light rain when Mason finally went to bed had intensified to a steady downpour that drummed against the lodge's roof and windows. Weather reports predicted continued rain for at least 36 hours, falling on already saturated ground and rapidly melting snow. Mason joined Walter and Vivian in the basement, where the copper network had become increasingly active. Multiple pipes now transmitted subtle vibrations, each with slightly different patterns, indicating various warning signals from different parts of the mountain. Walter pointed to the large map on the wall, now marked with red pins indicating trouble spots. "Water's rising faster than drainage systems can handle. Upper watersheds already at 200% normal volume for March." He traced several convergence points where multiple streams fed into larger channels. "If these connect, we're looking at potential flash flooding through the east side of town." Vivian checked the gauge connected to the main pipe. "Pressure's building in the upper system. Samuel's journals indicate that's a precursor to soil destabilization mudslides. Mason studied the map, mentally calculating water volumes and flow rates based on the terrain he'd observed. How quickly can we get sandbags to these choke points? He indicated several areas where strategic barriers could redirect water flow away from vulnerable structures. Town has emergency supplies at the firehouse, Walter replied, but we'd need council authorization to deploy them. Mason's expression hardened. Let's go talk to the council. The town hall buzzed with nervous energy as council members and department heads gathered for the emergency meeting. Mason noted Chief Reeves positioned near the mayor, her expression grim, as she consulted a tablet displaying weather radar. Walter joined a group of longtime residents who appeared to share his concern, their weathered faces tight with worry. Mayor Caldwell called the meeting to order, adjusting his glasses nervously. Thanks to everyone for coming on short notice. As you know, we're experiencing unusually rapid snowmelt combined with significant rainfall. Chief Reeves has requested emergency measures be implemented immediately. Gavin Blackwell entered with impeccable timing, flanked by two assistants carrying tablets and phones. Despite the weather, he appeared freshly pressed, though Mason noticed slight tension around his eyes. My apologies for the delay, Mr. Mayor. Had to check on our festival infrastructure. Blackwell took a position near the front, commanding attention without obvious effort. I understand there's concern about potential flooding, but I've consulted with my own meteorological experts. He nodded to one of his assistants, who distributed printed reports. They believe the situation, while concerning, doesn't warrant extreme measures that would disrupt the festival. Chief Reeves stepped forward. With all due respect, Mr. Blackwell, my officers have confirmed significant water accumulation above town. We're seeing soil saturation levels that preceded the '87 flood event. The '87 event occurred before modern drainage improvements, Blackwell countered smoothly. It involved very different precipitation patterns. He turned to address the room. Ladies and gentlemen, let's maintain perspective. We have thousands of visitors in Cedar Falls for the festival. A premature evacuation would cause panic, damage our reputation, and devastate local businesses that depend on festival revenue. Murmurs of agreement rose from several council members. Mason could see Blackwell's influence at work, the subtle pressure of economic interests overriding safety concerns, the practiced way he minimized risk without directly denying it. Walter stood. Samuel Harper predicted the '87 flood 3 days before any visible signs appeared. The same warning system is active now, showing patterns consistent with imminent danger. Blackwell's expression tightened momentarily before smoothing into practiced sympathy. Walter, everyone respects Samuel's contributions to this community, but we're talking about copper pipes in the ground versus modern meteorological technology. He gestured to his reports. Science, not superstition, should guide our decisions. Mason had heard enough. He moved to the center of the room, Scout at his heel. The copper system is science-applied seismic monitoring using principles the military has relied on for decades. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard in crisis situations. I've spent the past 2 days documenting specific warning signs throughout the watershed's soil liquefaction, forming sinkholes, compromised drainage channels. This isn't about weather predictions. It's about current ground conditions that have already reached critical thresholds. He approached the map displayed at the front of the room, indicating specific vulnerable areas. The festival grounds sit directly in the convergence path of 3 major drainage channels. If we act now, we can deploy resources to divert water flow and potentially save the festival. If we wait, he let the implication hang in the air. Mayor Caldwell looked torn, glancing between Mason and Blackwell. Mr. Reynolds, while we appreciate your expertise, you've been in Cedar Falls less than a week. Mr. Blackwell has invested considerably in this community and its future. Investment doesn't change physics, Mr. Mayor. Mason held his ground. Water flows downhill. Saturated soil fails under pressure. These aren't matters of opinion. A commotion at the door interrupted the standoff. A park ranger burst in, raincoat dripping on the polished floor. Mayor, the upper bridge at Elk Creek just washed out, waters rising fast at all monitoring stations. Chief Reeves immediately took control. That settles it. I'm implementing emergency protocols under Municipal Code Section 12.4. She turned to the mayor. Sir, I need your signature on the disaster declaration to access state resources. The room erupted in overlapping voices, council members arguing procedures, business owners expressing concerns about evacuations, emergency personnel already coordinating response teams. Through the chaos, Mason caught Blackwell's gaze. The developer's confident facade had cracked, revealing something darker beneath, not concern for public safety, but fury at losing control of the situation. Mayor Caldwell finally raised his hands for silence. All right, Chief Reeves, you have my authorization. Implement emergency protocols." He turned to the room at large. "Festival activities are suspended. Low-lying areas will be evacuated immediately." As the meeting dissolved into action groups, Mason found himself pulled aside by Chief Reeves. "Reynolds, I need someone who understands this situation at Evergreen Lodge. It's on higher ground and built to withstand these conditions. We're designating it as an emergency shelter." Mason nodded. "We've already begun preparations." "Good. Get back there and coordinate with Vivian. Walter and his team will handle sandbagging the east side approaches." She paused, studying him with newfound respect. "You were right about this. Thank you for pushing when it mattered." Outside, rain fell in sheets, turning streets into shallow rivers. Mason and Scout made their way back toward Evergreen Lodge, passing emergency vehicles and townsfolk hurrying to secure properties. The festival grounds stood abandoned paper lanterns and wooden bells, now sodden decorations drooping from rain-heavy strings. Scout suddenly stopped, head turning sharply toward the mountains. A deep rumbling sound rolled across the valley, not thunder, but something more ominous. The ground beneath their feet trembled slightly, as if the earth itself shivered. Mason recognized the sign from his engineering experience. Somewhere up the mountain, a significant mass of earth had just given way. The flash flood risk had just become a debris flow threat, far more dangerous and destructive. They needed to move quickly. Reaching the ridge where Evergreen Lodge stood, Mason paused to survey the valley below. The normally picturesque view had transformed into a scene of impending disaster. Swollen streams had overflowed their banks, water spreading across fields and parks. The lake's edge had become indistinct as rising water reclaimed shoreline. Throughout town, emergency lights flashed as evacuation efforts intensified. Evergreen Lodge itself hummed with activity. Vivian had clearly been preparing while Mason attended the council meeting. Additional vehicles filled the parking area, locals seeking higher ground travelers stranded by closed roads. Through the windows, Mason could see the great room filled with people, some helping arrange supplies, others comforting children or elderly residents. As Mason approached the copper bell station on the ridge above the lodge, caught his attention. In the gray downpour, it stood as a sentinel, water streaming off its surfaces in rivulets that seemed to trace the engraved patterns like illuminated text. On impulse, Mason diverted his path, climbing the short distance to the structure. Up close, the bell gleamed with rain, its copper surface darkened to a deep bronze. Mason reached for the striker Vivian had given him, still in his coat pocket, and with deliberate motion struck the bell once. The sound that emerged seemed amplified by the rain carrying across the valley with surprising clarity. Its vibrations traveled down through the copper tubes into the earth, connecting with the larger network Samuel had built. Mason felt rather than heard the mountain's response, a deep resonance that seemed to acknowledge his presence and purpose. In that moment, standing in the downpour with Scout beside him, Mason Reynolds, former soldier, drifting construction worker, reluctant hero, made a silent commitment to the lodge, the town, and the mountain that had somehow called him home. Whatever came down from those peaks in the hours ahead, he would face it with everything he had learned in war and peace. The mountain had chosen its guardian. Now it was time to prove Samuel Harper right. Evergreen Lodge transformed into a fortress against the storm. Residents from the lower town areas crowded into the great room, their faces etched with worry, as rain hammered against windows like desperate fists. Vivian moved among them with quiet efficiency, assigning sleeping spaces, distributing emergency supplies, and maintaining calm with her steady presence. Rosa had converted the kitchen into a communal feeding operation, turning simple ingredients into comfort food that helped settle the nerves of frightened children and anxious elders. Mason stood by the front window, watching water course down the hillside in rivulets that grew stronger by the minute. Scout remained at high alert, periodically returning to room 3 to check the copper system, then back to Mason with silent signals only the two understood. The mountain's warnings had become continuous, a constant vibration through the pipes that spoke of movement deep within the earth. Walter burst through the door, rainwater streaming from his jacket. His weathered face bore the strain of hours battling rising waters. East Bridge is gone. Main streets flooded up to the hardware store. We've got teams diverting flow from critical areas, but it's a losing battle. His voice dropped lower. Just confirmed a mudslide hit the old Parker Place on the North Ridge. House is gone. Chief Reeves followed moments later, radio crackling with emergency transmissions. Everyone accounted for at the Parker Place. They evacuated yesterday, thank God. But we've got reports of multiple slope failures throughout the valley. She unfolded a map on a nearby table circling areas of imminent concern with a heavy marker. State emergency services can't get through landslides, have blocked both access roads. Mason studied the map, military training kicking in as he assessed the situation. We're on our own for at least 24 hours. The lodge sits above the main flow paths, but that drainage channel behind the property could become a problem if the upper basin gives way. He pointed to a particular slope on the map. Scout and I checked this area yesterday. Soil was already saturated and showing signs of movement. As if summoned by his assessment, a low rumble rolled across the valley, the distinctive sound of earth breaking free from ancient moorings. The lodge trembled slightly, glasses rattling on shelves, frightened murmurs rippling through the gathered refugees. Outside, the rain intensified, driven sideways by gusting winds that bent trees like suppliants before an angry god. Scout suddenly bolted toward the stairs, barking with an urgency that cut through the storm noise. Mason followed immediately, taking the steps two at a time, arriving at room 3 to find Lisa already there, standing motionless beside the open floorboard. Her small face had gone paper white, eyes wide as she stared at the copper-lined cavity. "It's screaming," she whispered, voice barely audible. "The mountain is screaming." Mason knelt beside the opening, placing his hand directly on the copper tube. The vibration had changed, no longer the steady warning pulse, but a frantic, irregular tremor that traveled up through his arm into his chest cavity. He recognized the pattern from Samuel's journal, catastrophic movement imminent. Lisa looked up at him with uncanny certainty. "You need to ring the bell again, the special one on the hill. It's the only way to find the hidden room." Mason hesitated only briefly before trusting the child's intuition. "Stay here with the others, Scout Guard." He grabbed his coat and headed back downstairs, stopping only long enough to tell Vivian where he was going. The path to the bell station had transformed into a muddy stream that pulled at Mason's boots with each step. Wind-driven rain lashed his face, reducing visibility to mere yards. Lightning split the sky in jagged bursts, momentarily illuminating the chaos of the mountainside, where trees leaned at drunken angles undermined by flowing water and shifting soil. The copper bell stood defiantly against the elements, water coursing over its surface in sheets that followed the engraved patterns like illuminated script. Mason withdrew the striker from his pocket, its brass surface warm despite the cold rain, and struck the bell with deliberate force. The sound that emerged was unlike any previous ring, not the clear tone of the festival, nor the resonant hum of his first test. This was a discordant clash that seemed to fight against the storm itself, vibrations traveling visibly through the copper tubes that plunged into the earth. For several seconds, nothing happened beyond the continuing deluge. Then the ground shifted beneath Mason's feet, not violently, but with purpose, as if something deep within the mountain adjusted its position. A section of rock face 20 yards uphill suddenly transformed, a hidden seam, appearing where solid stone had seemed to exist moments before. Water poured from the opening like a curtain, revealing a narrow passage carved into the mountainside itself. Mason approached cautiously, combat instincts on high alert. The passage was man-made, and its walls lined with the same copper material as the detection system, its floor cut with precise channels that directed water away from the center path. A soft blue light emanated from somewhere deeper inside, throwing Mason's shadow in sharp relief against the wet stone. The tunnel extended perhaps 30 feet into the mountain before opening into a chamber that stopped Mason in his tracks. Unlike the rough-hewn passage, this room had been finished with meticulous care. Polished wood panels covered the walls, a generator hummed quietly in one corner, powering the blue-tinted lights, and a ventilation system kept the air surprisingly fresh despite the storm raging outside. But most remarkable was the content workbenches lined with tools and equipment far more sophisticated than those in the lodge basement, filing cabinets filled with neatly labeled folders and glass cases displaying what appeared to be patent models and prototypes. At the center stood a large drafting table covered with blueprints anchored by smooth river stones, and above it a portrait of Samuel Harper in military uniform, eyes gazing directly at anyone who entered. A voice from behind made Mason spin around. Samuel called it his sanctuary. Vivian stood in the tunnel entrance, rainwater dripping from her silver hair. "I've been trying to find it for 5 years." Her eyes moved across the room with wonder and vindication. He would disappear for hours, sometimes days. Said he was working on the mountain. I thought it was a figure of speech. Mason turned back to the drafting table, examining the blueprints with engineer's eyes. They detailed not just the copper warning system, but advanced applications that went far beyond simple detection, clean energy generation, utilizing geothermal principles, water purification methods that worked with natural filtration processes, structural designs that could withstand catastrophic events while working in harmony with environmental forces. "These are revolutionary," Mason murmured, carefully turning pages of designs that blended military precision with visionary concepts. "Some of this tech is decades ahead of current applications." Vivian approached a locked cabinet against the far wall, removing a key from around her neck, one she had apparently carried for years without knowing its purpose. "Samuel said if anything happened to him, I should find the heart of the mountain and use this." The lock turned with a solid click. Inside lay a metal box containing legal documents, patents, copyright filings, technical specifications, all properly registered and notarized but never publicly filed. A sealed letter addressed to Vivian sat atop the stack. She opened it with trembling fingers, reading silently before handing it to Mason. The letter detailed Samuel's intentions clearly. The technologies developed in his mountain sanctuary were meant to benefit Cedar Falls first, then be shared more widely once protections were in place to prevent exploitation. He had created a trust structure that would activate only when the mountain finds its next guardian, someone with the skills to understand and implement his work and the integrity to do so responsibly. A section toward the end caught Mason's particular attention. "Robert Blackwell attempted to steal my early work, recognizing its value before I fully understood it myself. His son will continue his efforts. The legacy must be protected not just from natural forces, but from human greed that would turn protection into profit at any cost." A tremendous crash from outside interrupted their discovery, the distinctive sound of earth and trees tearing free from the mountainside. The sanctuary trembled, dust shaking loose from ceiling beams. Mason carefully replaced the documents in their box. "We need to get back to the lodge. This hillside isn't stable." He secured the box inside his jacket. "We can come back for the rest when the storm passes." They emerged from the hidden chamber to confront a transformed landscape. What had been a forested slope above Evergreen Lodge was now a raw wound of exposed earth and broken trees. A massive section of hillside had given way, sending a river of mud and debris flowing dangerously close to the lodge's northern edge. Through the curtain of rain, Mason could see figures moving frantically around the building, evacuating the ground floor, shoring up defenses against the approaching flow. Mason and Vivian scrambled down the treacherous path, fighting against wind and flowing mud that threatened to sweep their feet from under them. Halfway down, Mason spotted a familiar silhouette working near the lodge's edge. Walter and several others attempting to channel the debris flow away from the foundation with improvised barriers. As they neared the bottom, another sound cut through the storm, an engine roaring at full throttle. A black SUV fishtailed along the flooded access road, fighting against currents that nearly reached its wheel wells. It skidded to a stop at the lodge's front entrance, and Gavin Blackwell emerged, his perfect appearance now disheveled by panic and rain. Two assistants followed, carrying computers and document cases, seeking sanctuary from the very disaster their boss had dismissed. Mason reached the lodge moments after Blackwell disappeared inside. The great room had transformed into an emergency operations center, with Chief Reeves coordinating response teams via radio, while Rosa and other volunteers tended to the needs of shell-shocked evacuees. Scout immediately bounded to Mason's side, pressing against his leg in silent confirmation that all was secure inside despite the chaos. Blackwell stood near the fireplace, arguing with Chief Reeves, his voice carried above the storm and frightened murmurs. "My development plans included comprehensive drainage systems that would have prevented exactly this situation. This disaster only proves Cedar Falls needs modernization." Mason approached quietly, the document box still secure inside his jacket. Scout positioned himself between them, a silent guardian reading the tension in the room. Chief Reeves noticed Mason, first relief breaking through her professional demeanor. Reynolds, thank God. We've got the North Drainage Channel threatening to breach. Walter says you might know how to reinforce it based on Samuel's designs. She pointedly turned away from Blackwell, dismissing his arguments. Blackwell's attention snapped to Mason, then to the bulge under his jacket where the document box pressed against the fabric. Something shifted in his expression, recognition, then calculation. What have you found? His voice dropped to a near whisper, tension vibrating beneath forced calm. Mason met his gaze steadily. Samuel's legacy. The real one, not land for your resort, but solutions that could actually protect this town. He turned to Reeves. The North Channel follows a design in Samuel's blueprints. There's a secondary containment system built into the hillside, but it needs to be manually activated. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, a section of map he'd studied in the sanctuary. There's an access point here about 50 yards behind the lodge. As Reeves organized a team to investigate, Mason felt Blackwell's hand grip his arm. Whatever you found, Reynolds, it belongs to this community, not just to Vivian, Harper, or yourself. As a prominent investor in Cedar Falls' future, I have a right to, Scout growled low and warning, forcing Blackwell to release his grip. Mason stepped back, creating distance between them. This isn't about rights or investments, Blackwell. It's about responsibility. Samuel understood that. You don't. Mason moved toward the back door where Walter and several volunteers were preparing to check the containment system. Blackwell's voice followed him, pitched for his ears alone. My father warned me about Harper's self-righteousness, said it would destroy this town's chances for real progress. Don't make his mistake, Reynolds. There are more practical ways to resolve this situation, arrangements that benefit everyone. Mason paused, turning back with military precision. Practical, like trying to build luxury cabins on unstable ground. Beneficial, like ignoring warnings that could have prevented this disaster. He gestured toward the frightened families huddled throughout the lodge. These people trusted your judgment today. How's that working out? Leaving Blackwell speechless, Mason joined Walter's team and headed into the storm. The north side of the lodge property had become nearly unrecognizable, a battlefield of mud and water, where the mountain's edge seemed to dissolve into flowing chaos. Following Samuel's map, they fought their way uphill to a concrete structure partially buried in the hillside, its presence revealed only by the recent earth movement. Inside, they found exactly what Samuel's notes had described, a series of heavy valve controls that, when properly adjusted, would activate a network of buried channels designed to redirect water flow away from the lodge and into a natural containment basin farther down the valley. It took the combined strength of 3 men to turn the primary valve, rusted from years of disuse, but when it finally moved, the effect was immediate and dramatic. The raging flow above the lodge visibly reduced as water diverted into the hidden system. Mason watched in quiet amazement as Samuel Harper's foresight once again protected the community he had loved years beyond his own death. Walter clapped a hand on Mason's shoulder, weathered face split in a rare smile. Damn if the old man didn't think of everything. When they returned to the lodge, soaked but triumphant, they found a situation developing in the great room. Blackwell stood near the fireplace, his composure restored, and addressing a group of council members who had taken shelter at the lodge. His voice carried the practiced conviction of a man accustomed to shaping perceptions. While this disaster is devastating, it presents an opportunity to rebuild Cedar Falls stronger than before. My company stands ready to lead that effort with plans already developed for modern infrastructure that would prevent future catastrophes. He gestured emphatically. What we're witnessing is the failure of outdated systems and piecemeal solutions. The copper network, while ingenious for its time, clearly wasn't sufficient. Mason moved through the crowd, Scout at his heel, listening as Blackwell continued his pitch. The developer had recovered quickly, already spinning disaster into opportunity, recasting himself as the solution rather than part of the problem. Several council members nodded along, desperate for reassurance that someone had answers. Lisa suddenly appeared at Mason's side, tugging insistently at his sleeve. The floor's talking again. Different this time, not scared, angry. Her small face held absolute certainty. You need to stop the bad man. Mason knelt to her level. What does the floor say, Lisa? The child closed her eyes briefly as if listening to a distant voice. That truth matters more than promises. That some things belong to the mountain, not to people who want to sell them. She opened her eyes, fixing Mason with a gaze too old for her years. He says you have to show them. Mason straightened, decision crystallizing. He moved toward Blackwell and the council members, Scout positioned at his side like a furry shadow. The document box felt heavy against his chest, a weight of responsibility rather than mere paper. Before you commit to anything, Mason interrupted, voice cutting through Blackwell's practiced speech, you should see what Samuel Harper actually left this town. He placed the box on the table before them, opening it to reveal the patents and legal documents. Not just a warning system, but solutions, clean energy technology, structural designs that work with natural forces instead of against them, water management systems decades ahead of current practice. He spread several documents across the table, official patents, trust agreements, implementation plans. Samuel created these for Cedar Falls. He established a trust to develop and implement them here first, then share them more widely. Their value isn't just in disaster prevention, they represent millions in potential revenue for the town, jobs, sustainable development. Blackwell's face drained of color as he recognized what lay before him. His composed facade cracked, revealing the desperate man beneath. This is preposterous. Harper was an eccentric with delusions of grandeur. These are probably just theoretical designs, impractical fantasies. They're fully developed, tested technologies. Vivian stepped forward, voice steady with newfound strength. Samuel spent decades perfecting them in a laboratory we just discovered in the mountain itself. She fixed Blackwell with a piercing stare. Your father tried to steal Samuel's early work. Is that what you've been after all along? The revelation hung in the air as council members examined the documents with growing amazement. Mayor Caldwell adjusted his glasses, squinting at patent valuations. These are extraordinary. The geothermal applications alone could transform our energy infrastructure. Blackwell made one final attempt to regain control. Even if these designs have merit, they require significant investment to implement capital that Cedar Falls simply doesn't have. His gaze swept the room, searching for allies. My company can provide that investment in partnership with... Actually, Mason interrupted, pointing to specific trust documents. Samuel established funding mechanisms through resource rights he quietly acquired over the years. The trust is fully capitalized, needing only the right management to activate. He looked directly at Blackwell. Management specifically structured to prevent exploitation by outside interests. The council members huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers as they processed this revelation. Chief Reeves stepped forward, addressing Mason rather than Blackwell. Who controls this trust now? Who makes these decisions for the town? Mason glanced at Vivian, who nodded slightly. According to these documents, control passes to Samuel's designated successor, someone he believed would understand both the technical aspects and the ethical responsibilities. He took a breath. Apparently that's me. Blackwell's laugh held no humor, only brittle desperation. This is absurd. You've been in Cedar Falls less than a week. You're an unemployed veteran with no connections to this community. He turned to the council members. Can't you see what's happening here? They're using this crisis to seize control of valuable intellectual property. Mayor Caldwell cleared his throat. Mr. Blackwell, you've been pushing us for months to sell valuable property to an outside developer with no deep connections to our community. He gestured toward the documents. At least these plans were created specifically for Cedar Falls by someone who lived here and understood our needs. As if punctuating the mayor's statement, the storm outside intensified, wind howling through the eaves of the old lodge, like the mountain's own voice joining the conversation. The lights flickered momentarily, plunging the room into shadow before stabilizing again. In that brief darkness, something shifted in the room's energy, a turning point, a decision point. Blackwell must have felt it too. His expression hardened into cold calculation. This isn't over. He collected his coat, gesturing for his assistants to follow. When this crisis passes and clearer heads prevail, we'll revisit this discussion. He moved toward the door, pausing beside Mason. You have no idea what you're getting into, Reynolds. Some legacies are burdens, not gifts. After Blackwell departed, disappearing into the storm with his entourage, the great room settled into a different kind of tension, the collective holding of breath that comes with recognizing a moment of transformation. Mason felt the weight of eyes upon him, questions hanging unspoken in the air. Scout pressed against his leg, warm and solid, a reminder of the one constant in his nomadic life since leaving the service. The dog looked up at him with amber eyes that held absolute trust, then turned his gaze toward the gathered townsfolk, as if to say, "These are our people now. This is where we stand." Through the window, Mason could see the mountain looming dark against the storm-torn sky. Samuel Harper had heard its warnings, had built a system to translate its ancient language for modern ears. Now that responsibility had passed to him, not just the technical knowledge, but the deeper understanding that some places demand defenders rather than developers. The copper pipes beneath the floor hummed with a new vibration, not warning now, but recognition. The mountain had found its guardian. The real work was just beginning.